The courtroom was filled with hushed whispers. Lawyers shuffled papers, the judge's gavel echoed across the room, and the jury's eyes were fixed on the defendant, Jake Thompson, a young man in his 20s who seemed out of place in the grand, intimidating courtroom. His hands trembled as he sat there, the weight of the charges against him heavy on his shoulders. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone waiting for the judge to deliver what seemed like the inevitable, a guilty verdict. Jake's lawyer, Sarah Adams, a rookie defense attorney, had done her best, but her arguments had been weak. The prosecutor, Greg Mallory, was a seasoned professional who had a long history of victories in high-profile cases. He had woven a narrative so convincing that it felt impossible to break. Jake had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, but with the evidence stacked against him, it was hard to see a way out. He was from a broken home, a troubled background, easy to write off as a product of his circumstances. The prosecution had painted him as a young man destined to fall into a life of crime. It seemed like everything was against him. And then, just as the judge was preparing to deliver his ruling, a figure stood up in the back of the courtroom, drawing the attention of everyone present. It wasn't just any person. This man was known by almost everyone in the room, even if most of them had never met him personally. The legendary Clint Eastwood. The room fell into a stunned silence. Clint had walked into this small-town courtroom with the kind of presence that commanded attention. No one knew why he was there, but his entrance had clearly rattled everyone. He had retired from acting years ago, and since then, his name had become synonymous with rugged masculinity and the quiet strength of his characters. Some people didn't even realize that Clint had an interest in law. His true passion had always been in films, in creating stories that resonated with the human experience. But now, here he was, standing up at the back of the room, his face as stoic as ever. His gray hair framed his sharp features, and his expression was unreadable, as always. The crowd turned to look at him, confusion and curiosity written across their faces. Clint surveyed the room for a moment, his eyes lingering on Sarah, who had paused in the middle of a sentence, completely thrown off by his presence. The prosecutor, Greg Mallory, raised an eyebrow in disbelief. Was this a publicity stunt? A mistake? No one was sure. But Clint Eastwood was here, and in this room, that meant something. After a moment, Clint spoke, his deep voice cutting through the silence. I'd like to offer my assistance to the defense. Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. What? She whispered to herself, glancing around to see if anyone else had registered the shock of the situation. I'm offering my help, Clint repeated, this time louder, his gaze steady. I've been following the case, and I believe I might be able to offer a fresh perspective. This young man doesn't deserve to be railroaded like this. The room buzzed with shock. How could Clint Eastwood, a man with no legal background, offer any help? Was this just another celebrity trying to play hero? But there was something in his voice, something in the way he carried himself, that made people hesitate. Clint Eastwood wasn't just any man. He was a force, a legend. The judge looked around the room, his gavel poised in the air as the murmurs grew louder. Mr. Eastwood, the judge finally said, his voice both firm and curious, I must admit, I'm not entirely sure how to proceed. You are not an attorney, and your involvement could complicate things. Clint stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. I may not be an attorney, but I've spent enough time studying the law to know when something's wrong. And from where I stand, this case reeks of injustice. The judge narrowed his eyes. This isn't a movie, Mr. Eastwood. This is a court of law. Clint nodded slowly. I understand. But I believe that sometimes, the truth is stranger than fiction. His words hung in the air for a moment before he added, I'm not asking to take over the case. I'm offering to consult. If you'll allow me, I'll assist this young man's lawyer, Sarah Adams. The judge paused, considering the request. The prosecutor, Greg, was already standing, his face flushed with irritation. Your Honor, Greg interjected, this is highly irregular. We cannot allow a former actor to simply waltz in here and offer legal advice. This is a serious matter. Clint turned his attention to Greg. I'm not here to play a role. I'm here because I believe justice should prevail, and that's all that matters. The judge considered this for a moment before responding. Very well. I'll allow you to consult with the defense team, but any further involvement will be subject to review. The room fell silent again, and Clint walked down the aisle to sit next to Sarah. Her eyes widened as he sat beside her, his calm demeanor offering a strange sense of comfort amidst the tension. Clint Eastwood, she whispered, as if unsure this was even real. What are you doing here? I'm here to help, he said, his voice steady. You've been doing well, but sometimes you need a little more than passion. You need strategy. Sarah nodded slowly, still processing the surreal nature of the moment. She had heard stories about Clint's sharp mind, stories that suggested he had a knack for seeing things others couldn't. Clint turned to her, his eyes sharp as he began to speak in a low, steady tone. We're not going to win this case by doing things the way the prosecution expects. We need to dig deeper. We need to challenge everything they think they know. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what Clint was suggesting. Was he serious? Could he really help? And if he could, would it be enough to save Jake from a future behind bars? Before Sarah could voice her doubts, Clint spoke again. Just follow my lead. I'll take care of the rest. The courtroom had quieted once more, the judge preparing to continue the trial. But the atmosphere had shifted. Something had changed. Clint Eastwood was in the room, and with him came the faintest glimmer of hope. The trial was far from over, but for the first time, Jake Thompson dared to believe that there might be a way out. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had never planned on becoming a lawyer. In fact, the very idea had seemed far removed from his world. He was supposed to be a Hollywood star, a director, a man who shaped films with his quiet strength and stoic presence. Yet, even in the midst of his fame, Clint had always felt a pull toward justice, toward understanding the law and its deep roots in society. Born in San Francisco in 1930, Clint had always been a man of few words. Even as a child, he preferred to observe and listen rather than jump into conversations. His upbringing wasn't perfect, his family struggled financially, and his father was an alcoholic. But it was during these years that Clint first discovered the value of hard work and resilience. He learned early that life didn't hand out favors. If you wanted something, you had to take it. This mentality drove him to succeed in everything he did, whether it was in sports, at school, or later, on screen. He was always athletic, a natural in the water and on the field. But his first major break wasn't in sports, it was in acting. By the late 1950s, Clint had made a name for himself in small roles, but it was his portrayal of the mysterious, tough characters in westerns that catapulted him to fame. It wasn't just his acting that impressed people, it was his understanding of human nature, his ability to embody the quiet, brooding hero. He was the man who didn't need to speak much to communicate everything. And in doing so, he became a cultural icon. However, beneath the fame and the glitzy Hollywood lifestyle, Clint had always carried a deep interest in the law. He often said that if he hadn't become an actor, he might have pursued a career in law. He had an inherent respect for the system, for the way it worked, or, in some cases, didn't work. It was the complexities of justice that fascinated him. The idea of truth and morality, and how it played out in the courtroom, intrigued him more than any movie script ever had. Over the years, Clint's life took many unexpected turns. While he directed hit films like Unforgiven and Million Dollar Baby, he would often spend time reading legal textbooks, studying famous trials, and even consulting with legal experts in his personal life. As he grew older, his desire to understand the intricacies of law became more than just a hobby, it became a passion. Still, it wasn't until after his retirement from acting in the early 2000s that Clint began to take the legal world more seriously. He had moved out of the limelight, preferring a quieter existence at his ranch in California. But the world hadn't forgotten him. In fact, Clint found himself more and more drawn to the idea of using his platform to make a real difference in the world. It was then that he began exploring legal cases, not just as an observer, but as someone who could actually make a difference. He didn't pursue a law degree or become a licensed attorney, he was too old for that. But he did spend countless hours attending law seminars, speaking with legal professionals, and becoming deeply familiar with legal procedures. His reputation as a man who could analyze situations with the same precision he once brought to his roles as a director soon spread. What started as a curiosity turned into a calling. He became something of an unofficial legal consultant to various lawyers, offering his expertise in the form of advice and insight. He was often met with skepticism, even disdain, from the more traditional members of the legal community. He wasn't a lawyer, and some believed he had no business getting involved in legal matters. But Clint didn't mind. In fact, he found it invigorating. The legal world was like an intricate puzzle, one that he was determined to solve. The courtroom was a place where truth could emerge, even when it seemed impossible to find. And Clint, with his years of experience observing human behavior and understanding the nuances of right and wrong, was convinced he could bring a fresh perspective to the table. But despite all of this, Clint had kept his involvement in law mostly under wraps. Until now. Until Jake Thompson. Jake's case had landed on Clint's radar by accident. A close friend of Clint's, a retired judge, had asked him to take a look at the case after hearing about the glaring inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument. Clint wasn't sure at first, he had no interest in becoming the face of some high-profile legal battle. But the more he read about Jake, the more it became clear that the young man was being wrongfully accused. And Clint could not ignore the nagging feeling that he could help. The courtroom was where truth and lies collided head-on. It was where justice was supposed to prevail, but often, it didn't. Clint had seen it too many times in his life. He had read about cases where people had been sentenced for crimes they didn't commit, and he knew all too well that not all lawyers played by the same rules. Some were in it for fame or money, others, for a true sense of justice. Clint wasn't sure where Sarah Adams fell on that spectrum yet, but he knew that the odds were stacked against her. And Jake. Clint's memories of Hollywood, his years of hard work, and his countless hours of studying the law all converged in that one moment. He wasn't just there to make a dramatic entrance, to bring some celebrity star power into the courtroom. He was there because he knew, deep down, that this was his chance to use everything he had learned over the years. This was his opportunity to make a difference. This wasn't just about Jake, it was about righting a wrong. The more Clint thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about law. It was about life. About giving people a chance to change. About giving them the opportunity to see justice served, no matter how twisted the road might be. And Jake? Jake needed a chance. As Clint sat in that small courtroom, his mind already working through potential strategies and scenarios, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a case. It was the start of something bigger, something that could change the course of not just Jake's life, but Clint's own as well. As the judge prepared to resume the trial, Clint looked over at Sarah. She had no idea what she was about to face. But Clint did. He had seen enough of life to know when it was time to act, and now, it was time for action. This wasn't a movie. This was real life. And Clint Eastwood was about to prove that even at the age of 70, a man could still have the sharpest legal mind in the room. The courtroom was alive with tension as Clint Eastwood's presence continued to disrupt the proceedings. The judge's gavel echoed again, signaling the resumption of the trial. Sarah Adams, still in disbelief over Clint's sudden appearance, glanced at him nervously. She had spent years preparing for this case, but now, with the legendary Clint Eastwood sitting next to her, she felt both empowered and utterly out of her depth. Jake Thompson, the young man accused of robbery and assault, sat anxiously at the defense table, his eyes wide with uncertainty. He had been convicted in the eyes of the public before even stepping foot in the courtroom. The media had painted him as the typical young criminal, someone who had grown up in a broken home, someone who had followed the wrong crowd, someone whose fate was sealed. But Jake wasn't a criminal. He had made mistakes, yes, but he wasn't a thief. He wasn't a violent person. He had dreams, big ones, ones that didn't involve a life behind bars. Yet, the prosecution's case had been so airtight, with damning eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence, that it felt like there was no way out. And then Clint Eastwood stepped in. As the trial resumed, Clint leaned in toward Sarah, his voice low but sure. "We need to focus on the details. The little things. The things that the prosecution is taking for granted." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She knew the prosecution had a strong case, but Clint's words made her realize just how much she had been overlooking. She had been so focused on the big picture, the witnesses, the evidence, that she hadn't noticed the cracks in the prosecution's story. Prosecutor Greg Mallory, standing with his usual confidence, turned to address the court. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-40s, his demeanor cold and unyielding. "Your Honor, the evidence against the defendant is clear. Multiple eyewitnesses have identified Jake Thompson as the man who committed this heinous crime. We have surveillance footage placing him at the scene. And we have the victim's testimony, which is consistent and credible." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. Clint's eyes narrowed as Mallory spoke. The way he spoke was smooth, calculated, almost rehearsed. He had been playing this game for years, and he knew how to pull the right strings. But Clint had seen enough in his time to know when someone was hiding something, or worse, when they were trying to manipulate the truth. Jake's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He had already been through a week of testimony, each day chipping away at his hope. Now, with Clint's involvement, it was as if a small flicker of hope had reignited. But it wasn't enough to erase the fear. Clint leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Sarah, we need to look at that footage again, particularly the timestamps. There's something off about the time frame. It doesn't add up." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed that before. She turned her attention back to the screen, where the surveillance footage from the convenience store was playing again. It showed a blurry figure in a hoodie walking into the store at exactly 8:14 p.m. The camera angle was poor, but the figure matched Jake's general build. It was all the prosecution needed, an unshakable piece of evidence. But Clint's words echoed in her mind. The timestamps. The prosecutor had been so focused on the footage that he hadn't mentioned one crucial detail: the time the store's security system had been set to. Sarah had pulled the court's attention to it once, but it hadn't gained much traction. Now, with Clint's sharp eyes leading the way, it was clear that there was a discrepancy. The footage was taken 3 minutes after the store's security system had malfunctioned, meaning the timestamps couldn't be trusted. The figure in the footage could have been anyone. "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted, standing up. She had regained her confidence, but only because of Clint's guidance. "I'd like to challenge the reliability of the surveillance footage presented by the prosecution. It was recorded after a system malfunction, and the timestamps cannot be verified. We cannot trust that this footage definitively shows my client." The room went still. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. Even the judge's expression froze as he considered Sarah's objection. Clint had watched Sarah grow in confidence during the course of the trial, but now, in this moment, he saw her find her footing. It was a small step, but a step toward victory. Greg Mallory immediately shot up, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a baseless claim. The footage has been authenticated and reviewed by our expert witnesses. But Clint was already on his feet, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I've spent enough time in this world to know when something doesn't smell right. The prosecution is trying to rely on a piece of evidence that is unreliable. If you're going to convict someone based on a few blurry seconds of footage, then we might as well throw out the entire justice system." Mallory looked like he had been slapped. The room was on edge, the air crackling with the intensity of Clint's words. Sarah watched in awe. Clint wasn't just playing the role of a legal consultant, he was taking control of the courtroom. His no-nonsense approach had the entire room in its grip. The judge, a seasoned man who had seen countless trials, took a long, measured look at Clint before responding. "I will allow a review of the security footage and the timestamp discrepancy. If it is proven that the evidence is unreliable, we will reconsider its validity." Sarah exhaled, her heart racing. For the first time since the trial began, she felt like they had a chance. Clint returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. He had made his mark, but this was only the beginning. He knew the road ahead would be tough. The prosecution wouldn't back down easily, and they still had a long way to go before they could secure Jake's freedom. Jake turned to Clint, his voice trembling. Do you think I'm going to get out of here? That I'll be okay?" Clint looked at him, his eyes intense but filled with quiet conviction. "I'm going to fight for you, kid. We're not giving up. Not now, not ever." The stakes had been raised. What had started as a case of a seemingly guilty young man had now turned into a battle of wits, a fight for justice in a courtroom that was more volatile than either side could have imagined. The battle was just beginning. The courtroom was quiet, almost expectant, as the judge ordered a recess for the review of the surveillance footage. Clint leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he replayed the scene in his mind. His words had done their job, he had shaken the confidence of the prosecution, and for the first time, the defense team had an opening. But Clint knew that one victory wasn't enough. They had to keep pushing, keep searching for the truth hidden behind the layers of lies. Sarah Adams sat across from Clint, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had always prided herself on her meticulous attention to detail, but Clint's insight had opened her eyes to flaws she hadn't noticed. Now, the weight of the case felt heavier than ever, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope. Clint's presence in the courtroom was more than just a strategy, it was a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, Sarah believed that they could win this case. Jake Thompson, who had been sitting quietly next to his attorney, looked up at Clint. There was an anxious energy in his eyes, a mixture of desperation and hope. "Do you think they'll drop the charges?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint met his gaze, his expression stoic but reassuring. "We've got a shot, kid. But you're going to have to trust the process, and trust that we'll do everything we can to uncover the truth." The recess seemed to stretch on forever. The hum of whispers in the courtroom became a steady backdrop to Clint's thoughts. His mind raced through the details of the case, looking for any other inconsistencies, any piece of information that could help them build their defense. The prosecution had made a strong case, but Clint had always believed that justice had a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. When the judge finally returned to the bench, the room fell silent once again. The court clerk handed over a document to the judge, and the judge began reading it aloud. After a thorough review of the footage and the timestamp discrepancy, it has been determined that the evidence presented by the prosecution cannot be fully trusted, the judge announced. I will allow additional time for further investigation into the authenticity of the footage. Until then, the prosecution's primary evidence will be temporarily excluded. Clint let out a small breath of relief. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a critical blow to the prosecution's case. The evidence they had relied on so heavily had been undermined, and now, it was up to Sarah and Clint to take advantage of the opening. The prosecutor, Greg Mallory, stood up and shot a look of frustration toward the defense table. "Your Honor, we object to the exclusion of this key piece of evidence. This footage is legitimate, and the timestamp can be verified by our expert witnesses. The judge didn't waver. I understand your objection, Mr. Mallory, but I'm granting the defense's request for a review. We will reconvene in 3 days for the next phase of the trial. In the meantime, I advise both sides to prepare accordingly. With the gavel strike, the tension in the room lifted slightly, but it was clear that this battle was far from over. The recess had given the defense some breathing room, but the next few days would be critical in determining whether Jake would walk free, or remain behind bars. The next morning, Clint and Sarah sat in the back office of the courthouse, the weight of the situation beginning to set in. They had won a battle, but the war was still on. Clint had already begun thinking about their next steps. They needed to dig deeper, find more evidence, and turn the prosecution's case upside down. Clint, I keep thinking about the eyewitness testimony, Sarah said, her voice tinged with frustration. We can't ignore it. The witnesses were adamant. They identified Jake as the person who attacked the victim. It's hard to refute something so direct. Clint's gaze hardened. Eyewitness testimony isn't always as reliable as people think, Sarah. People think they saw something, but in the heat of the moment, memory can be skewed. We need to look for inconsistencies in their accounts. Something that doesn't line up. Sarah nodded, deep in thought. She had already interviewed the witnesses, but Clint's words reminded her that she might have been too quick to accept their statements at face value. It was time to go back, re-examine everything, and see if the prosecution's case was as solid as they'd made it appear. We need to track down every single witness, Clint continued. If we can find just one discrepancy, one piece of doubt, we might be able to shake the foundation of their case. As Sarah prepared to leave, Clint stopped her. Sarah, don't get too caught up in trying to disprove their case. Focus on finding the truth. The truth always wins in the end. The words hung in the air as Sarah walked out of the office, determined to follow Clint's advice. The next few days were a blur of interviews, research, and intense investigation. Sarah followed Clint's strategy to the letter, revisiting the witnesses and reviewing their testimonies with a fine-toothed comb. As she dug deeper, something began to emerge. A pattern of inconsistency in the witnesses' statements. One witness had claimed that the attacker wore a distinct red jacket, while another had said it was blue. The victim, who had been in a state of shock, had failed to provide any clear details about the assailant. Clint's earlier words echoed in Sarah's mind, focus on the details. With each piece of information Sarah uncovered, the picture of Jake's innocence became clearer. The prosecution had relied too heavily on eyewitness testimony that was, at best, unreliable. The case they had built was shaky, and Sarah was beginning to see the cracks. But they still had one major obstacle to overcome, the prosecution's expert witnesses. They had to be ready for the next phase of the trial, when the prosecution would undoubtedly try to bring their most convincing experts to testify. The day before the next phase of the trial, Clint and Sarah met in the courthouse once more. The stakes were higher than ever, but Clint's calm demeanor helped steady Sarah's nerves. We've come this far, Clint said, his voice firm but reassuring. Tomorrow, we take it to the prosecution. We're going to tear their case apart, piece by piece. And if they're not careful, they'll be the ones in the hot seat. Sarah took a deep breath. I'm ready. Let's do this. As they prepared to enter the courtroom the next morning, Clint looked over at Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. Remember, the truth will come out. It always does. The climactic journey was about to unfold. Clint and Sarah were on the cusp of revealing the cracks in the prosecution's case, but the next few hours would be the most critical yet. The courtroom was set for another battle, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let the truth be buried any longer. The courtroom was buzzing with an energy that could almost be felt in the air. The trial had been on a knife's edge for days, but now, it seemed that the outcome was about to tilt one way or the other. The prosecution had been relentless, their case a mountain of evidence and testimony. But Clint Eastwood and Sarah Adams had begun to chip away at it, piece by piece. They had found inconsistencies in the witnesses' stories and in the evidence itself, and now they were about to put everything to the test. As the court reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge entered, followed by the jury, and the gallery fell silent. Clint took his usual seat next to Sarah, his eyes scanning the room. Today would be pivotal. There would be no turning back after this. Clint had spent the last few days preparing a final move, a moment of clarity that would stun everyone in the room. Sarah, though she had her doubts, was trusting Clint. She had seen him work before, but this was different. The stakes were higher than ever. Jake's life hung in the balance, and the prosecution would do everything they could to ensure that the case went in their favor. Prosecutor Greg Mallory stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we are prepared to call our next witness, our forensic expert, Dr. Judith Franklin. She will confirm the reliability of the surveillance footage and offer her testimony about the evidence in this case." Clint's lips tightened in anticipation. The expert witness was going to be the final blow in the prosecution's case. But Clint wasn't just going to let it stand. He had a plan, and it was one that would expose their key piece of evidence for what it truly was, a lie. Dr. Judith Franklin, a sharp and confident woman in her early 50s, walked to the witness stand. She adjusted her glasses and gave the courtroom a professional nod as she sat down. Her reputation was impeccable, and if anyone could solidify the prosecution's argument, it was her. "Dr. Franklin," Mallory began, his voice smooth, "could you please confirm for the court that the surveillance footage of the defendant at the scene of the crime is indeed authentic and reliable?" Dr. Franklin adjusted her papers and looked toward the jury. "Yes, Your Honor. The footage has been carefully reviewed, and all timestamps, angles, and details have been corroborated. The video shows Mr. Thompson entering the store at 8:14 p.m. and leaving shortly after the assault occurred." Clint sat up straighter, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. "Your Honor," Clint stood, his voice cool but firm, "I request permission to cross-examine the witness." The judge nodded, and Clint stepped forward with deliberate confidence. He looked at Dr. Franklin, then turned to the jury, meeting their eyes one by one before speaking. "Dr. Franklin, you've stated that the surveillance footage is reliable. Can you tell us, then, about the recent malfunction in the store's security system? The one that caused the timestamps to be inaccurate?" The room fell silent, a hush sweeping through the gallery. Dr. Franklin blinked, clearly taken off guard. She had expected Clint to challenge the video's authenticity, but she hadn't anticipated this specific question. "Well, the system malfunction was minor," Dr. Franklin stammered. "It was only a few minutes, and it didn't affect the overall quality of the footage. The timestamps were still in sync with the rest of the data." Clint smiled slightly, leaning forward as he locked eyes with the witness. "But the timestamp in question, the one that places the defendant at the scene of the crime, is 3 minutes ahead of the actual time, isn't it? How can you claim that the footage is entirely reliable when the timestamps are inconsistent with the known time?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The tension in the air grew thick, and for the first time since the trial began, the prosecution looked rattled. Dr. Franklin's confident demeanor wavered. "Your Honor, she hesitated, then recovered. "We made sure that all systems were checked thoroughly. The footage is accurate, and we stand by it." Clint's voice grew colder, his tone unyielding. "Isn't it true, Dr. Franklin, that the store's security system malfunctioned multiple times in the days leading up to the incident? Isn't it possible that the timestamps on this particular video were altered due to a glitch, not a reliable reading of the actual time?" Dr. Franklin's face tightened. I suppose that is a possibility, but the footage was reviewed by experts, and we have confirmed that the timestamp, while not perfect, is still within an acceptable range." Clint shook his head. "An acceptable range? This is not about rounding off times, Dr. Franklin. This is about a man's life. You cannot casually dismiss these inconsistencies as if they were trivial. This footage could have been manipulated, and you are asking us to ignore that fact. The prosecution's expert witness was on the defensive now, her credibility cracking in real time. The courtroom was hanging on every word, every moment. Clint wasn't just questioning the validity of the video, he was calling into question the very foundation of the case the prosecution had built. At that moment, Sarah felt the weight of the room settle on her shoulders. She could see it now. Clint was unraveling the prosecution's entire argument with nothing more than his sharp legal mind and a few pointed questions. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a force of nature. Dr. Franklin hesitated, then finally responded, her voice less certain than before. I understand the implications, Mr. Eastwood. But I still stand by the evidence presented. Clint turned to the jury, his voice calm but authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've been presented with what we were told was irrefutable evidence. But what we are seeing is a pattern of inconsistencies, errors, and assumptions. The prosecution's key evidence, the footage, cannot be trusted. It is flawed. And if we can't trust this, how can we trust anything else? The weight of his words hung heavy in the courtroom. The jury was visibly shaken, their eyes darting between Clint, the witness, and the defense table. The emotional climax had arrived. Clint had turned the tables completely. What had once seemed like an airtight case was now in jeopardy. Clint turned back to Dr. Franklin, his expression hardening. Dr. Franklin, I suggest you take a closer look at the evidence you've so confidently defended. If you do, you might just realize that you're not as certain as you think. The expert witness sat back, her face flushed, realizing that she had been outmaneuvered. The prosecution's case was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As Clint returned to his seat, Sarah could hardly breathe. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moment of emotional triumph. The stakes had never been higher, and yet Clint had managed to do what most lawyers couldn't, make the truth undeniable. Jake, sitting in the defendant's chair, exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping in what could only be relief. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at freedom. But Clint wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. They had made it through the hardest part, but the final battle was still ahead. The prosecution would fight back, of that Clint was certain. But he wasn't afraid. This was Clint Eastwood, after all. And in his world, justice was always worth fighting for. The days following Clint Eastwood's dramatic cross-examination were filled with whispers, heated debates, and a palpable sense of anticipation. The courtroom had been shaken to its core. The prosecution's expert witness had faltered under Clint's questions, and the credibility of their primary evidence, the surveillance footage, was now in doubt. But the battle wasn't over yet. The next phase of the trial would determine whether Clint's strategy would succeed or if the prosecution would rebound and close the case with a win. Jake Thompson sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He had been holding his breath for days, waiting for the final verdict. He knew Clint was doing everything possible to secure his freedom, but the fear of what might happen still lingered in his chest. The weight of the courtroom stairs, the eyes of the jury on him, it was suffocating. He had learned over the past weeks to trust Clint, to trust the process. But the uncertainty of the final outcome still haunted him. Clint and Sarah sat at the defense table, strategizing their final move. They had one last chance to solidify their defense and show the jury that Jake was innocent. Every move mattered now. The courtroom had already seen Clint's brilliance in the cross-examination, but now it was time for him to put all the pieces together. The judge, having previously been firm with his rulings, now called the court to order. Ladies and gentlemen, the judge's voice boomed across the room, we are now at the final stage of the trial. The defense has completed their presentation, and the prosecution will now make its closing remarks. Afterward, the jury will deliberate. Clint knew that this was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He stood, adjusting his tie and walking with steady confidence to the front of the courtroom. As he began speaking, there was an energy in his voice that the jury couldn't ignore. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Clint began, his gaze sweeping over the room, locking with each juror's eyes. "We stand here today not just to defend a man, but to defend the truth. This case isn't about the strength of evidence, it's about whether we can trust the truth when it stares us in the face. And when we strip away the unreliable testimony, the faulty footage, and the distractions, the truth is clear." The courtroom was silent, hanging on his every word. Jake Thompson was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was caught up in a situation beyond his control. But he didn't commit the crime he's accused of. The evidence has been manipulated. The prosecution has relied on shaky eyewitness testimony and unreliable footage to build a case against him. And I ask you, how can we convict a man based on such fragile ground? Clint paused, allowing his words to sink in. He turned slowly, pacing a few steps before facing the jury once again. "You've seen how the prosecution's key witness faltered under cross-examination. You've seen how their so-called irrefutable evidence they presented as foolproof, has been called into question. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't about guilt. It's about doubt. And there is more than enough doubt here to suggest that Jake Thompson should not be convicted." Clint let his final words resonate with the jury. "I urge you to remember the core of our justice system, the presumption of innocence. If there's any doubt, if there's even the smallest chance that Jake is innocent, then you must find him not guilty. To do otherwise would be to convict a man on lies. The truth is out there, and I believe you'll find it if you look at the facts." Clint sat down, his body relaxed but his expression intense. He had said everything he needed to say. Now, the fate of Jake Thompson was in the hands of the jury. As the prosecution delivered its closing statement, Clint remained composed, watching them with an unwavering focus. Mallory was trying his best to recover from the damage Clint had done, but Clint could tell that the prosecutor was rattled. Every word Mallory spoke seemed to ring hollow. The confidence that had marked the early days of the trial was gone, replaced by desperation. Mallory spent most of his closing statement rehashing the same evidence, insisting that the eyewitnesses were reliable and that the footage, despite its flaws, was enough to convict Jake. He claimed that the defense was trying to confuse the jury, to distract them from the overwhelming proof of Jake's guilt. "We've presented the facts. We've shown you the evidence," Mallory said, his voice rising. "We've proven that Jake Thompson was at the scene of the crime. He's the only one who had the motive. He's the only one who fits the description. The defense has tried to cloud the truth, but you cannot ignore the overwhelming weight of this case." Clint watched calmly as Mallory wrapped up his statement. The prosecutor's words were forceful, but Clint knew that the truth had already been planted in the jury's mind. They had seen the cracks in the prosecution's case. They had heard Clint's masterful dissection of the evidence. And now, the decision was in their hands. The jury filed out of the courtroom, and the room fell into a tense silence. Clint sat back, exhaling slowly, his mind racing. There was nothing more to be done now. He had given everything he had to the case. The rest was up to the jury. Sarah sat beside him, her hand nervously tapping against the table. "Do you think we did enough?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Clint turned to her, his face calm but his eyes hard with resolve. "We've done everything we can. Now it's up to them. All we can do is wait." Minutes passed like hours, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. Clint had handled countless trials in his career, but each one still carried a weight. The stakes had never been higher. He could feel the eyes of the world on him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreman stepped forward, his face unreadable. The judge cleared his throat, signaling that the moment had arrived. "Will the jury foreman please read the verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman took a deep breath and turned to face the court. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Thompson, not guilty on all charges. The room erupted in a wave of emotion. Jake's face contorted with disbelief before it softened into a look of pure relief. He looked at Clint, his eyes filled with gratitude. Clint stood, his face breaking into a rare, subtle smile. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands shaking as she wiped away a tear. They had done it. The weight of the moment was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, Clint allowed himself to relax. Justice had been served, and Jake Thompson was free. As the courthouse emptied, Clint walked with Sarah and Jake to the exit. It had been a long road, but they had made it through. Jake, his life now spared, turned to Clint. "You saved my life," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Clint shook his head, a half-smile on his face. "You saved yourself by being honest. I just helped you find the truth." Jake nodded, his expression one of deep gratitude. "I'll never forget this, Clint. Never." As the three of them walked out of the courthouse, Clint glanced up at the sky. The case was over, but there was always another one waiting. For now, though, Clint allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The truth had prevailed. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The courthouse doors closed behind Clint Eastwood, and the fresh air hit his face like a wave of relief. The weight of the trial had lifted, but there was no time to bask in the victory. The city was bustling around him, and the streets continued to move with their usual rush, unaffected by the monumental battle he had just fought. In a way, that was the nature of life, unrelenting, ever-moving, regardless of the victories or defeats it saw. Clint adjusted his jacket and turned to see Jake and Sarah following him. Jake walked with a newfound lightness in his step, the heavy burden of a wrongful conviction finally lifted from his shoulders. His face, usually tight with worry, now had a soft smile, a smile that spoke volumes about the freedom he had just regained. "Clint," Jake started, his voice quieter now, more reflective, "I don't even know how to thank you. You gave me my life back." Clint paused, his gaze steady. He'd heard the gratitude before, from clients and friends, but something about Jake's voice struck him differently. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, something Clint knew all too well. "You don't need to thank me," Clint replied gruffly, turning his gaze toward the horizon. "You fought for yourself. I just helped you get the chance to do that." Sarah, walking beside them, smiled at Clint's words. She had seen him do this 100 times before, deflecting credit and focusing instead on the person who had made it through. It was one of the things that made Clint Eastwood both an incredible lawyer and a deeply human one. He didn't do it for the recognition. He did it for the people who needed him. "Still," Jake insisted, "I wouldn't be here without you. I'd be sitting in that cell, guilty of something I didn't do. You proved everything." "You." "Don't," Clint interrupted, raising his hand. "What's important now is that you're free. No one can take that away from you. Don't let your past define your future." Jake looked at Clint with a mix of gratitude and wonder. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know it's better now. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a shot." Clint's face softened slightly, the edges of his usual stoic demeanor giving way to a rare glimpse of warmth. "That's the best kind of freedom, Jake. A chance to start over." The three of them continued walking, their steps in sync. Sarah, ever the optimist, piped up, "So, what's next for you, Jake? Are you planning to head back home, start over?" Jake scratched the back of his neck, clearly considering her question. He had never really thought about his life after the trial. After all, the constant cloud of suspicion had overshadowed his every decision. Now, with the weight of a wrongful conviction lifted, he found himself staring down a future full of possibilities. The years he had lost to the system could never be returned, but he could still find a way to rebuild. "I don't know yet," Jake admitted, looking out at the busy city. "I've got family back in Portland. I think I'll go visit them, see if they'll take me in." Maybe get a fresh start out there. Find work, maybe even go back to school. Clint smiled, his eyes narrowing as if scrutinizing the path ahead. That sounds like a good plan. But remember, the past won't always let you go that easily. It'll always try to pull you back. You've got to keep moving forward, Jake. The past is a weight, and the only way to lighten it is to move past it. Jake nodded. He understood. His time in jail had taught him one thing: how quickly life could go from one extreme to the other. He had been a man with everything, and then a man with nothing. He had lost his future, but now, Clint's words had given him hope for a new one. As the trio reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Clint turned to face Jake one final time. "Remember what I said," Clint reiterated, his voice softening for just a moment. "Life's tough, but as long as you have the chance to change, you take it. No one gets that kind of opportunity every day." "I'll keep that in mind," Jake promised, a slight, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Clint. I won't forget this." Clint gave a small nod, his usual impassive expression back in place. "Good. Take care of yourself, Jake." As Jake turned to leave, Clint and Sarah stood together for a moment. The weight of the case had lifted, but Clint knew it would be only a matter of time before another challenge arose. That was the nature of his world. Cases never stopped coming. But for now, he allowed himself the luxury of a moment of peace. Sarah looked up at Clint, a knowing smile on her face. "I think you might actually care about that guy." Clint grunted in response, looking at the city around them. "I care about doing the right thing. That's all. Doesn't matter who the person is." Sarah chuckled. "Sure, Clint. Keep telling yourself that." Clint smiled, a genuine smile this time, but he didn't argue. He knew Sarah was right. Deep down, he did care. It wasn't just the law that drove him, it was his belief in people's potential to change, to fight for what was right, even when the odds were against them. He turned toward the courthouse, then back toward the street where Jake had disappeared. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had fought the battle. He had won. And for one man, at least, the world would be a little bit better because of it. The fight for justice never ended, but every victory made it worthwhile. As the story of Clint Eastwood and Jake Thompson's journey to justice came to a close, the lessons were clear. Clint's sharp legal mind had proven that no amount of evidence could overpower the truth. But the real victory lay in the ability to start again, to rise above what had once seemed like an impossible future. The trial was over, but Clint Eastwood knew better than anyone that the aftermath of such a high-profile case was rarely peaceful. It was a strange sensation, walking away from a courtroom with a sense of accomplishment only to find that the world beyond the walls didn't stop to reflect. Life, as always, continued to spin at its usual pace. Clint had spent the past few days recuperating, catching up on paperwork and doing the sort of administrative work that always seemed to pile up after a big case. Despite the win, his mind constantly wandered back to the courtroom, to the fight that had kept him up late at night, poring over evidence, working through strategies. But now, there was a new reality. Jake was free, but Clint had done what he could, and his next case was always on the horizon. That was how his life worked. It was a sunny afternoon when Clint received a call from an unexpected source. It was Sarah. "Clint, you might want to come by the office. There's someone here who wants to meet you. And I think you'll want to hear what they have to say." Clint raised an eyebrow, knowing that Sarah didn't often call with a sense of urgency unless something truly unusual was afoot. He grabbed his jacket and made his way to the office, a feeling of curiosity settling in his gut. When Clint arrived at the office, the door was already open, and Sarah was sitting at her desk, speaking with a man Clint had never seen before. The man was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and had an air of confidence that made him seem important. The moment Clint walked in, the man stood up and extended a hand. "Mr. Eastwood, it's an honor," the man said with a smile. "My name is Aaron Mills. I've heard a lot about you." Clint shook his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man. "I don't recall having the pleasure of meeting you before." Aaron smiled a little wider. "I suppose I can understand why. I'm not exactly a public figure. But I represent a very unique opportunity. And I think you're the right man for the job." Clint didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. Sarah watched the exchange with quiet interest. "I'm listening," Clint said, his voice calm but cautious. He had learned over the years that anyone who used words like unique opportunity usually had an agenda. Aaron took a seat across from Clint, his demeanor relaxed but purposeful. "I work for a firm that handles high-stakes cases, corporate disputes, mergers, high-level acquisitions. You name it. But we've recently become involved in something that is less conventional." Clint remained silent, his gaze unbroken as he waited for Aaron to elaborate. His mind was already running through the possibilities. Another corporate battle? Another celebrity scandal? Maybe even a criminal case, though Clint preferred to avoid those these days. But then Aaron dropped a bombshell. "The case involves a matter of national security," Aaron said, lowering his voice just slightly. "And we need someone with your particular set of skills to handle it." Clint leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued despite his wariness. "National security," he repeated. "You want me to be a part of some government case?" Aaron's face tightened ever so slightly, but he held Clint's gaze. "Not exactly. It's more private. But the stakes are high. Very high. And we think someone with your reputation for cutting through the noise and finding the truth would be invaluable." Clint didn't respond immediately, instead running through the details. This wasn't the type of case he usually handled, but the idea of something bigger, something with more weight, was tempting. He had spent his career fighting for justice, but something about this felt different. The kind of case that could change the course of his future. Still, Clint wasn't someone who jumped into things without understanding all the angles. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I'm not in the business of handling national security issues, Aaron. My focus is on justice. Truth. If you're asking me to play a role in something that doesn't fit with that, I'll pass." Aaron didn't seem discouraged. Instead, he seemed prepared for Clint's resistance. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with," Aaron said. "But this is a chance to uncover something huge. Something that could change the course of an entire industry, or even an entire country." Clint's brow furrowed, but he could feel the pull of curiosity. He had dealt with powerful people before, corporate giants, politicians, even criminals with influence, but this was different. National security. Private interests. That was a world Clint had only glimpsed at the periphery. "Why me?" Clint asked, his tone direct. Aaron's gaze didn't waver. "Because you don't back down. Because you see through the lies. And because you've got a reputation for not being easily intimidated. There's a lot of pressure around this case, Mr. Eastwood. We need someone who will stand firm." Clint stared at him for a long moment, weighing the options. He wasn't sure what this was all about, but he had an instinct for these things. Something about Aaron Mills felt genuine, but also a little too polished, a little too prepared. He wasn't just a lawyer asking another lawyer for help, this was a man with an agenda, and it had to do with power. But Clint had been in the game long enough to know that sometimes, power was exactly what you needed to right a wrong. "I'll think about it," Clint said, standing up. He extended his hand to Aaron. "But if I'm going to get involved, I'll need to know everything. Every detail." Aaron stood, his expression pleased. "Of course. I'll send over everything you need. You'll have all the information. But, Mr. Eastwood, I'm telling you, you're the only one who can do this." Clint nodded, his mind already processing the possibilities. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing: whatever it was, it would be another challenge. And challenges were what Clint lived for. As Aaron left, Clint turned to Sarah, who had remained silent through the entire conversation. She was watching him closely, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Clint asked, his tone cautious. Sarah thought for a moment before speaking. "It's a risk. But it could be big. Maybe the kind of case that gives you something more to fight for." Clint nodded slowly. "Yeah, something bigger than I've dealt with in a while. But I'm not sure it's the kind of fight I want to take on." Sarah gave him a look. "You don't exactly shy away from fights, Clint. Whatever it is, I'm sure you'll find a way to win." Clint's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the pile of files on his desk. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Clint felt the spark of excitement. This could be the case that would bring him back to his roots, to the days when he fought for truth and justice, regardless of the odds. "All right," Clint said, standing and grabbing his coat. "I'll take it. But I'm not making any promises." Sarah smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As Clint walked out of his office, his thoughts lingered on Aaron's words. National security. Power. Secrets. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but one thing was certain. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The air in Clint Eastwood's office felt heavier than usual the day after his meeting with Aaron Mills. The case Aaron had brought to him still sat like a puzzle in the back of Clint's mind. A high-stakes, private matter involving national security, everything about it seemed like a game played by people with far more power than Clint was used to handling. Yet, Clint had always prided himself on his ability to navigate through murky waters. After all, he didn't get to where he was by backing down from a fight. The call came early the next morning. Clint had just finished a black coffee, leaning over some paperwork, when his phone rang. He picked it up, not looking at the caller ID, knowing instinctively it was Aaron. "Clint," Aaron's voice greeted him, smooth and sure as ever. "I've sent you the files. I trust you're ready to get started." Clint sat back in his chair and sighed. He hadn't even opened the files yet, but he knew he had to take the first step. There was no turning back now. "I'm ready. But I need you to explain something to me first," Clint said, his voice sharp. "What exactly is this case? Why is it classified as national security?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence hanging heavily. "I can't give you all the details just yet," Aaron replied, a hint of something guarded in his tone. "But what I can tell you is that this is about a corporate deal, a merger, to be precise, that has gone terribly wrong. There's a lot more to it than just a business transaction. Powerful people are involved, and they've got a lot to hide." Clint's mind immediately began to turn. Corporate mergers were complicated, but they weren't typically his arena. Still, he could sense something much bigger was brewing beneath the surface. Something that wasn't about money or business, at least, not entirely. "And why me?" Clint asked, cutting to the chase. "Why do you need me for this?" Aaron's voice dropped, the tone now filled with more weight. "Because it's more than just a business deal. It's a matter of trust, Clint. These people, these organizations, don't just control industries. They control information. Power. And if this deal goes through without being questioned, it could change the course of everything we know. We need someone who isn't afraid to dig into the darkness, to expose what's hidden." Clint stood up, pacing across his office. He hadn't anticipated something of this magnitude, but the gravity of Aaron's words was sinking in fast. Secrets. Power. The kind of power that could reshape industries and even nations. The adrenaline kicked in. This was the kind of challenge Clint had been waiting for, an opportunity to fight against something much bigger than any courtroom drama. "All right," Clint said after a long pause, "Send me everything you've got. But I expect full transparency. No more secrets." Aaron's voice softened, his words carrying a note of assurance. "You'll have everything you need, Clint. I trust you'll see it through." The line went dead, and Clint stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of the situation. He had agreed to step into the unknown, but now he had to make sense of the files that were already sitting in his inbox, waiting for him to make the first move. The files were extensive, dozens of documents, financial reports, contracts, and a handful of encrypted communications. It was a jigsaw puzzle, each piece representing a part of the story Clint would need to unravel. He leaned forward, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of the chaos. As a lawyer, he had seen his fair share of complex cases, but nothing quite like this. The deeper he dug, the more questions arose. The names in the files were unfamiliar, corporate giants, shadowy figures with connections that ran deeper than Clint could imagine. And somewhere within those files, Clint knew, lay the truth. The piece that would pull the entire web of deceit into focus. He spent the next several hours combing through the documents, looking for inconsistencies, red flags, anything that didn't add up. And then, at the very bottom of a set of financial statements, he found something that made his heart skip a beat, a payment to an offshore account, listed under a false company name. The amount was staggering, millions of dollars. The type of money that could buy anything, including loyalty, silence, and influence. Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just a corporate merger, it was a cover-up. Someone was using the merger to launder money, funneling it into shadowy corners of the world where no one could trace it. This was bigger than just business. This was about control, control of information, of power, of people's lives. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "I just got off the phone with Aaron," Sarah's voice crackled through the line. "He's expecting an update from you." Clint rubbed his forehead. "I've only just started digging through the files. But I've found something, there's an offshore account involved. It's tied to the company behind this deal. Someone's laundering money, using this merger as a front." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, her voice more urgent now. "Clint, this is bigger than you think. Aaron wasn't entirely upfront with you. There are people involved in this who have the kind of reach that can ruin lives. The kind of people you don't want to cross." Clint's instincts kicked into overdrive. The pieces were starting to come together, and the situation was growing more complicated by the minute. The stakes were higher than he had realized. He had walked into this case with the belief that he was fighting for justice, but now, he could feel the weight of the world shifting beneath him. "I'll be careful," Clint said, his voice steady. "But this has to be exposed. This isn't just about business. It's about right and wrong." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice filled with concern. "Just remember, Clint, there's no going back once you dig too deep." Clint's mind raced as he stared at the glowing screen in front of him. He had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. The truth was buried deep within these files, and Clint wasn't the kind of man to back away from a fight. He had walked into this case with one purpose, to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. But as he prepared to dive even deeper into the shadows of this case, Clint realized that the real question wasn't just about who was hiding the truth, it was about who would do whatever it took to keep it buried. Clint sat at his desk, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The files in front of him were now a tangled mess of reports, financial sheets, encrypted messages, and corporate documents. He had been at it for hours, but the deeper he dug, the more complex everything seemed. It was like pulling on a single thread, only to watch the entire tapestry of lies unravel before him. The payment he had found in the offshore account was just the tip of the iceberg. It pointed to an elaborate money laundering operation, hidden behind the corporate merger that Aaron had described. But something still didn't feel right. The people involved were not just businessmen, they were influential figures with connections to some of the most powerful industries and governments. It wasn't just about profit. This was about something much bigger, something Clint wasn't yet able to fully understand. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Clint looked up, irritated at the interruption. He wasn't in the mood for company. But when the door opened, it was Sarah, stepping inside with a serious expression on her face. "We've got a problem," she said, closing the door behind her. Her tone was grave, and Clint knew immediately that whatever it was something he wasn't going to like. Clint leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes. "What kind of problem?" Sarah took a seat across from him, her eyes scanning the piles of documents on his desk. "I just got off the phone with one of my contacts. Someone's been digging into your case. It's not just corporate. It's bigger than that. Whoever is behind this merger, they've got resources, Clint. And they don't want anyone asking questions." Clint's pulse quickened. He had expected resistance, but this was different. If they were already taking action against him, it meant he was closer to the truth than he realized. He sat up straighter, his mind already racing with the implications. "Who's digging into me?" Clint asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though a storm was brewing inside of him. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know for sure. But I've been getting strange calls. And I've noticed some unusual activity on my end. People with resources, people who can make things disappear, are watching you. They've connected your name to the case, and that's a problem." Clint's instincts flared, his mind jumping to conclusions. He had faced threats before, but this felt different. Whoever was behind this case had the power to make things very difficult for him, and for Sarah. The danger was no longer abstract, it was real, and it was closing in fast. "You're sure about this?" Clint asked, his eyes hardening as he leaned forward. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "They know we're digging. And they're not going to just let this go. I've worked with powerful people before, Clint, but these guys, they're not your average corporate sharks. They'll stop at nothing to keep this under wraps." Clint's mind was already spinning with options. He had known there would be danger, but hearing it from Sarah made it feel tangible, imminent. His eyes shifted to the files on his desk, and he saw the lines connecting everything more clearly now. It wasn't just about exposing corruption in the business world, it was about power. The kind of power that controlled economies, governments, even entire countries. Whoever was behind this merger was playing for much higher stakes than Clint had initially thought. "What do we do now?" Clint asked, his voice steady, his mind already planning his next move. Sarah leaned in, her expression serious. "We keep going. But we need to be smarter. These people know how to cover their tracks. We need to make sure we're one step ahead of them. If they're on to us, they might already be setting traps." Clint nodded. The game had changed, and now it wasn't just about winning the case, it was about survival. But he had never been one to back down from a challenge. He wasn't going to let these faceless enemies intimidate him. They might have resources, but Clint had something they didn't, experience. And a relentless drive to uncover the truth. "I'll dig deeper," Clint said. "But I need your help. Keep an eye on the contacts you've got. Let me know if anything unusual pops up." Sarah gave him a small nod, her expression still tense. "I'll do what I can. But Clint, be careful. They're not just businessmen. These people play dirty. And they won't hesitate to make you a target if you're too close." Clint's eyes narrowed, a steely determination settling over him. "I've been a target before. But I've always fought my way out. And I'm not stopping now." As Sarah left the office, Clint sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind kept replaying the details Sarah had shared, strange calls, unusual activity. Someone was trying to cover their tracks, and they were willing to go to great lengths to make sure he didn't uncover the full truth. But Clint had never been intimidated by people like that. If anything, it only made him more determined to find out what was really going on. He turned back to the files on his desk and began to sift through them again, looking for the threads that would lead him to the heart of the conspiracy. His eyes moved over the numbers, the names, the encrypted messages, until something caught his attention. A series of transactions between the companies involved in the merger. On the surface, they looked legitimate, standard business exchanges, payments for services rendered. But something about them felt off. The amounts were too precise, the timing too coordinated. And then he saw it, a pattern, one that matched the movements of the offshore accounts. Clint's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he began to trace the accounts, cross-referencing the transactions with other companies, other names. And that's when he found it, the name he had been looking for, Gregory Weston. Weston was a name that appeared time and time again, buried within the corporate structure of the companies involved. He was listed as a board member, an advisor, a key player. But the more Clint dug, the more he realized that Gregory Weston wasn't just a businessman. He was something far more dangerous, someone who had connections to some of the most influential figures in the world. People who didn't hesitate to take matters into their own hands. Clint sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. This was it. The heart of the operation. Gregory Weston was the man pulling the strings, the one responsible for hiding the truth. But now Clint had a name, and with it, the door to everything he needed to uncover. But as Clint stared at the name on the screen, a cold chill ran down his spine. He had no idea just how far-reaching Weston's influence truly was. And now that Clint was onto him, the danger wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. The hidden enemy had been revealed, but the real battle was only just beginning. As Clint prepared to take the next step in his investigation, he knew the risks were mounting. He was now up against a force that wasn't just fighting for money or power, it was fighting to keep its secrets buried, no matter the cost. And Clint wasn't sure yet if he was prepared to face what was coming next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The darkness outside Clint Eastwood's office felt thicker than it should. Night had fallen, the streets outside his window bathed in the glow of city lights, but in his office, there was only the flicker of his desk lamp and the quiet hum of the computer. Clint's mind was racing, the weight of everything that had unfolded over the past few days threatening to crush him. Gregory Weston. The name that had appeared in Clint's investigation now haunted him. He wasn't just another corporate executive, and Clint knew that now. Weston was a key figure in something much darker, a part of a machine that stretched far beyond the business world. The more Clint uncovered, the more he realized that Weston was not someone to be trifled with. He had too much power, too many connections. Clint leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He had been staring at the screen for hours, trying to connect the dots, but the pieces were scattered everywhere, nothing seemed to make sense. Weston's involvement was more than just business. His name had been linked to a web of corporate mergers, government connections, and criminal organizations. And now, Clint was in too deep. There was no turning back. But then, a knock at the door broke his concentration. Clint's first instinct was to ignore it, he didn't want anyone disrupting his thoughts. But something told him it wasn't just another interruption. His hand hovered over the drawer where he kept his personal weapon, a reminder of the kind of cases he handled. Clint had learned a long time ago that danger often came when least expected. "Come in," he called out, his voice calm but tinged with caution. The door opened, and to Clint's surprise, it wasn't Sarah who entered. It was Aaron Mills. Clint's eyebrows raised in surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked, standing up from his chair. Aaron didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the room, his face serious, eyes scanning the office with a mixture of familiarity and wariness. "I need to talk to you, Clint." This can't wait. Clint's mind raced. He hadn't expected Aaron to show up unannounced. The last time they spoke, Aaron had been calm, composed, but now there was a sense of urgency in his demeanor. Clint's gut told him this wasn't just a casual visit. "What's going on?" Clint asked, leaning against his desk. Aaron's voice lowered, barely above a whisper. "Clint, they know you're digging. Weston's people. They've already started moving. And it's not just about the case anymore." Clint felt a sharp pang of anxiety in his chest, but he masked it with a stoic expression. "What do you mean, moving? What's happening?" Aaron hesitated for a second, then stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "I've been getting calls. Threats. I don't know exactly how, but someone in Weston's circle is on to us. They know you've been asking questions, and now they're making moves. They'll stop at nothing to keep this under wraps." Clint's jaw tightened. He had known the risks, but hearing Aaron confirm it made the danger feel far more real. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Weston was a man who operated in the shadows, pulling strings behind closed doors, and Clint had unwittingly walked into his path. Aaron continued, his eyes filled with concern. "They won't just silence you with a lawsuit or smear campaign. These people have a way of making things disappear. If you keep pushing this, you're not just risking your career, you're risking your life." Clint stood silently for a moment, weighing his options. The easy way out would be to walk away from the case, let it go, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But Clint wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge, especially not one like this. The deeper he went into the investigation, the more he realized that Weston wasn't just a businessman. He was a puppet master, and Clint was tangled in his strings. But Clint was no stranger to fights like this. "I'm not backing down," Clint finally said, his voice steady but resolute. "I don't care how powerful Weston is. If he's hiding something, I'll find it. I'll expose him." Aaron's expression shifted, his brow furrowing with frustration. "Clint, you don't get it. This isn't just about finding the truth. Weston's people aren't afraid to do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. They've got access to everything: money, influence, and muscle. They can make you disappear without anyone even noticing." Clint's resolve only hardened. He had seen it all before: the threats, the intimidation, the men who believed they could control everything. But Clint wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. "I've been in situations like this before," Clint said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I know how to handle people like Weston. The deeper you dig, the more they try to silence you. But I've never been afraid of them. And I'm not afraid of Weston." Aaron looked at Clint with a mixture of admiration and concern. "I respect that, Clint. But this isn't just another case. These people aren't just playing for money or power. They're playing for something far bigger." Clint looked at Aaron, studying him carefully. "What do you mean? What's bigger than money or power?" Aaron hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether or not to tell Clint the whole truth. "There are things happening behind the scenes, Clint. Things that could change everything. Weston's not just a businessman, he's involved in a global network of influence. They control governments, media, information. And they don't just want to keep their secrets hidden, they want to reshape the world. They're playing a game that's far beyond anything you or I can imagine." Clint felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had always known that power could corrupt, that people would do anything to maintain control. But this? This was something else entirely. The kind of power that could reshape entire nations. If what Aaron was saying was true, Clint was already in way over his head. But even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Clint knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "I don't care what kind of game Weston's playing," Clint said, his voice firm. "If he's involved in something this dangerous, I'm going to stop him. I don't care what it takes. Aaron studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. I knew you'd say that. But be careful, Clint. This is a dangerous game, and there are forces out there that you don't fully understand. If you keep pushing, they won't just threaten you, they'll come after you. Clint didn't flinch. Let them come. Aaron gave a resigned sigh, as though he knew Clint wasn't going to change his mind. All right. But just know, this won't be easy. You'll need all the help you can get. Clint nodded, determination in his eyes. I'll handle it. Just make sure you keep your end of the deal. Aaron hesitated, then gave Clint a firm handshake. I'll do what I can. But don't say I didn't warn you. As Aaron left, Clint sat back down at his desk, his mind racing. He had known that this case would be dangerous, but he had never anticipated this kind of threat. Weston wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was a force of nature, a man who could destroy lives with the flick of his finger. And now, Clint had made himself a target. But that didn't matter. Clint wasn't afraid. The truth had to come out, and he was the one who would expose it. Clint stared at the flickering screen before him. The battle lines had been drawn. And now, the real war was about to begin. Clint stared at the files in front of him, his mind buzzing with the information he'd gathered so far. The night was growing late, but sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Each document he reviewed only brought him closer to the horrifying realization that he had stepped into something much larger than a simple corporate merger. It was a labyrinth, a shadowy network of power that stretched into every corner of the world. Clint had always been good at spotting patterns, but this one was different. The more he dug into the paper trail left behind by Weston and his associates, the more complex the conspiracy became. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the false fronts, it all pointed to one thing: control. But control of what? Who were these people, and what were they really after? The knock at his door was almost expected by now. As soon as Clint heard it, he stood, his muscles tense. He knew it wasn't just Aaron this time. This was bigger than them both. Whoever was knocking had the power to change everything. Come in, Clint called, his voice low and steady. The door creaked open, and in stepped Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with concern. We need to talk, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Clint's heart sank. He could see the fear in her eyes. Something had changed. He motioned for her to sit, and as soon as she did, he knew the news wasn't good. What's going on? Clint asked, his voice just above a whisper. Sarah looked over her shoulder, ensuring no one could hear them. Then, she spoke in a voice barely above a murmur. I did some digging, just like you asked. And Clint, what I found is worse than I imagined. Clint's pulse quickened. Worse than we imagined. What did you find? Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. She placed it on Clint's desk, the weight of the envelope matching the heaviness in the air. I've been tracking the financial flows you pointed me to. There's more money moving around than we thought. A lot more. And it's all funneling into one place. A private entity. No names, just initials. It's called RL Corporation, but when I tried to dig deeper, it vanished. There's nothing. Just empty shells. No ownership records. No addresses. Nothing. Clint leaned forward, intrigued and alarmed at the same time. RL Corporation. That's not a name I've seen in any of the reports. Who's behind it? I don't know, Sarah replied, her voice shaking with frustration. I traced the funds all the way to a place in the Cayman Islands, but that was just another dead end. Every time I get close, everything gets wiped clean. It's like they don't want anyone looking too closely. Clint's mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle starting to align. But why the Cayman Islands? Why all the secrecy? Sarah paused before answering. Because that's where the real power lies, Clint. Not in the corporate deals or the money laundering. The Caymans are a hub for offshore accounts, sure. But it's also a haven for people who want to hide their tracks. People who want to keep their hands clean while pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Whoever is behind RL Corporation. They're not just hiding money. They're hiding influence. And that's the scariest part. Clint sat back in his chair, his thoughts turning over the new information. If the people behind Weston's merger were also connected to this elusive RL Corporation, the web had just become far more tangled. They weren't just dealing with one powerful player, they were dealing with an entire network. A network of powerful individuals who didn't care who they hurt or how many lives they destroyed as long as they kept their hold on the world's wealth and influence. Do you think Weston's involved with them? Clint asked, his voice steady. I'm not sure, Sarah replied, shaking her head. But everything I've seen so far points to him. There's no direct connection between Weston and RL Corporation, but the money trails lead to the same places, and Weston's always been able to keep things out of the public eye. But someone is pulling his strings, someone far more dangerous than we realized. Clint's mind was working overtime now, pulling together the new information with what he already knew. The puzzle pieces were starting to form an image, one he didn't like. Weston wasn't the mastermind. He was just a part of something much bigger. But the bigger question was, who was the puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes? Before Clint could say anything more, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting their conversation. She glanced at it, and her face drained of color. What is it? Clint asked, his heart beginning to race. Sarah didn't answer at first. She stared at the phone screen for a moment before placing it down on the table and looking Clint directly in the eyes. They're moving faster than I thought, she said, her voice tight. We're not just dealing with corporate espionage or money laundering anymore, Clint. We've stumbled onto something much more dangerous than we realized. Clint's instincts flared. What do you mean? What's happening? Sarah's voice was grim as she continued. I just got word. Someone's been hired to handle our case. Someone from Weston's side. They've already started looking into us. And they're going to make sure we don't get any further. Clint's jaw clenched. He had been expecting this. But hearing it from Sarah made it feel far too real. They had crossed a line. The forces they were up against were prepared to do whatever it took to keep their secrets hidden. We're not backing down, Sarah, Clint said, his voice low but resolute. This thing goes too deep. We can't stop now. She gave him a look, a mixture of concern and resolve in her eyes. I'm with you, Clint. But we need to be careful. If they're on to us, we've got to move fast. They won't hesitate to silence us if we're not careful. Clint nodded, his resolve hardening. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of lies, corruption, and power. But Clint had always been good at finding the truth, even when it was buried deep. We'll keep pushing forward, Clint said. But we're going to need to be smart. We need allies. People we can trust. Sarah looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. I'll start reaching out. But Clint. I've seen what these people can do. If we're not careful, we could end up as the next targets in their game. Clint didn't flinch. He had never been one to walk away from a challenge. And this was a challenge unlike any he had ever faced. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but Clint knew that they had only scratched the surface of the true scope of the conspiracy. Weston was just a small player in a much larger game, one that involved powers Clint couldn't even begin to comprehend. But that didn't matter. They had no choice but to keep going. As Clint and Sarah began to plan their next steps, Clint felt the weight of the situation settle even heavier on his shoulders. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. But one thing was clear, they were in this together. And no matter what it took, Clint would stop at nothing to expose the truth. The web had tightened, and Clint had no choice but to fight his way through it. The feeling of being watched never left Clint. The moment he stepped out of his office, the tension was palpable. It was as if the entire city had become a maze of shadows, each corner hiding someone or something waiting for him to make a mistake. The night air outside felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond his reach. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he felt truly safe, but tonight, it seemed like the walls were closing in faster than ever. Clint hadn't been able to shake the warning Sarah had given him earlier. He had expected retaliation from Weston's people, but the reality of it was much more sinister than he could have anticipated. Sarah's information about RL Corporation had only deepened the mystery, and Clint now knew they were dealing with something far beyond Weston. The more he uncovered, the more the shadows seemed to gather around him, closing in with a crushing weight. "Do you think they'll come for us tonight?" Sarah's voice had echoed in Clint's head as he walked down the darkened hallway of his office building. It was a reasonable question. As he had told her, there was no turning back now. But he hadn't given her a direct answer. The truth was, Clint wasn't sure. But he wasn't going to wait around for Weston's people to make their move. He had a job to do, and he was going to finish it, no matter the consequences. Clint climbed into his car, his eyes scanning the street around him. He wasn't paranoid, he was just being cautious. He had learned long ago that in his line of work, being cautious was often the difference between life and death. "Think, Clint," he muttered to himself. "What do you know? What's the next step?" The situation had escalated quickly. The threats, the people closing in on him, and the connection to RL Corporation. Clint had to act fast, or he'd be buried under the weight of it all. His thoughts turned to his next move. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly. But time wasn't on his side. Every second that ticked by brought him closer to an unseen enemy. He had been in this kind of situation before, where the stakes were high and the risks were even higher. But this time, the enemy wasn't just another ruthless criminal syndicate or corrupt businessman. No, this time, the game had changed. Weston and his shadowy allies weren't just playing for money, they were playing for control. They were willing to do anything, to keep their power intact. As Clint's car wound through the quiet city streets, his mind worked over the possibilities. Who could he trust? Who could he turn to for help? The deeper he dug, the more it seemed like everyone had a price, and Clint wasn't sure who was genuinely on his side anymore. That's when it hit him. He needed to meet with someone who knew the dark side of the world, the people who operated in the shadows and thrived there. Clint knew exactly who to contact. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed a number, hoping that the person on the other end of the line would pick up. "Yeah," came the gruff voice on the other end of the line. Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need information. I need to know everything about RL Corporation. I'm willing to pay." There was a pause before the voice responded. "You're getting in deep, Clint. You sure you want to go down this road?" Clint gritted his teeth. "I don't have a choice. I need the information. Now." Another pause. Clint could hear the sound of shifting papers on the other end of the line. "All right, I'll make some calls. But I'm not the only one who knows how to dig up the truth. You keep digging, and the more heat you're going to draw." "I'll take the risk," Clint said, already hanging up the phone. There was no time to waste. He sped through the streets, the world blurring around him as he made his way to the meeting spot. It was a small, inconspicuous bar on the edge of town. No one would expect to find anyone of importance there, which was precisely why it was the perfect place for a covert meeting. As he parked his car and stepped into the dimly lit bar, Clint immediately scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. He'd met with shady characters before, but the air tonight felt different, charged with an undercurrent of danger. A figure sat in the back booth, hunched over a drink. Clint's gaze locked onto the person. There was no mistaking the silhouette, it was someone Clint had worked with before, but never fully trusted. He had no choice now but to rely on them. Clint slid into the booth across from the man. "You have the information?" Clint asked, keeping his voice low. The man, a rough-looking guy named Marco, glanced up at Clint through half-lidded eyes. His face was scarred, a map of old battles lost. "Information ain't free, Clint," Marco said with a smirk. "You know that." Clint's jaw tightened. "I'm willing to pay. Just tell me what you know about RL Corporation. Marco's expression didn't change, but Clint could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew the name, knew what it meant. "I don't know everything about them," Marco said slowly, glancing around the bar. "But I know enough to tell you that they're not just a bunch of rich guys hiding their money. They've got a hand in everything: politics, law enforcement, media, and even some of the biggest tech firms in the world. They're untouchable." Clint leaned forward. "What do you mean, untouchable?" Marco leaned in too, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I mean, whoever is behind them, RL Corporation. They've got people in the highest places. They control the game, Clint. And anyone who tries to take them down ends up like the rest, buried." Clint's mind raced. "And Weston? How does he fit into all of this?" Marco hesitated before answering, his eyes shifting nervously. "Weston's a small fish in this pond. He's got the connections, but he's not the one pulling the strings. The real power behind RL Corporation is someone else entirely. Someone far more dangerous." Clint felt the weight of the word settle in his chest. He had known all along that Weston was just a piece of the puzzle. But hearing Marco confirm it, he wasn't sure whether it made him feel relieved or more terrified. "Who's behind it?" Clint asked, the question burning on his tongue. Marco shook his head. "I don't know. But I can tell you this much: whoever they are, they don't just play dirty, they play to win. And if you keep digging, Clint, they'll make sure you're the one who loses." Clint didn't back down. "I've already come this far. I'm not stopping now." Marco's eyes softened just a fraction, as if he understood the determination behind Clint's words. But his voice was still filled with warning. "Just remember, Clint. There are some things better left alone. Some people who can't be stopped. And the people behind RL Corporation? They're those kinds of people." Clint stood, slamming a handful of cash onto the table. "I'm not walking away. Find me the rest of the information. I'll be waiting." Clint turned to leave, his heart racing. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever, and now there was no going back. As he stepped back into the night, the sense of being hunted came rushing back. The people behind RL Corporation were closing in, and Clint had only just begun to understand the true extent of their reach. The chase had begun. And Clint was no longer just playing a game, he was fighting for his life. Clint's pulse quickened as he stepped back into his car, the night air feeling colder than ever. The information Marco had given him echoed in his mind. Untouchable. It was a word Clint didn't take lightly. He'd crossed paths with powerful people before, but those who operated in the shadows of organizations like RL Corporation were a different breed entirely. Clint had always been someone who prided himself on his ability to anticipate threats, to stay one step ahead. But now, it felt like he was constantly chasing after the shadows. No matter how much he learned, the answers seemed just out of reach, slipping through his fingers. And every piece of information only made the puzzle more complex. As Clint drove through the quiet streets of the city, his mind kept racing. If Marco was right, and Clint had no reason to doubt him, then everything had changed. The simple corporate merger Weston had been involved in was just the tip of the iceberg. He was looking at something far more dangerous, an organization that stretched its claws into every sector imaginable, holding power in politics, media, law enforcement, and even the tech industry. Whoever was behind RL Corporation had mastered the art of invisibility, operating in the background while controlling everything in plain sight. These weren't just businessmen or politicians. These were people who didn't need to show their faces because their influence was absolute. If Clint was going to get to the bottom of it, he needed to find out who they were, before it was too late. He couldn't afford to wait anymore. Every second spent hesitating brought him closer to danger. Weston had already proven he was willing to do anything to protect himself and his allies, but Clint now knew the real power behind Weston's empire was even more dangerous. As Clint parked outside his apartment, he noticed something out of place, a black SUV parked across the street. At first, it seemed harmless, just another car on the street, but something in the way it sat there, motionless, triggered his instincts. It had been there for the past half hour or so, and the driver had not moved. He didn't know why, but Clint had the unsettling feeling that whoever was inside was watching him. He stepped out of his car cautiously, locking it behind him. His senses were heightened. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting from side to side as he made his way toward the building. But as he passed the SUV, his gaze briefly met the tinted window. Even though he couldn't see the driver, Clint could feel the weight of the gaze that lingered just beyond the glass. His heart skipped a beat. Not good. Clint kept walking but picked up the pace. He reached his apartment door and unlocked it quickly, slipping inside. He immediately went to the window and peered out, but the SUV was already gone. He frowned. There had been no other cars in the area when he arrived, and the sudden appearance of that vehicle was far too coincidental. "They're on to me." Clint didn't believe in coincidences. The people behind RL Corporation had a way of covering their tracks. If they knew what he was after, they wouldn't hesitate to act. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to Sarah, "We're being watched. Be careful. They're closing in." Then, Clint turned to his laptop, firing it up. He needed to be sure. He had a gut feeling, but he wasn't going to take any risks. He pulled up the information on RL Corporation that Marco had given him, cross-referencing it with the details he had gathered earlier about Weston. There was one lead that hadn't been fully explored yet, the name of a man Marco had mentioned in passing. Clint couldn't remember it exactly, but he had a vague recollection. It was a name tied to RL Corporation, someone who held significant sway in the organization. Clint thought about it for a moment, then typed the name into his search bar. The results were immediate and chilling. There were no public records of the person he was looking for, but there were traces. There were mentions in forums, encrypted messages, and whispers in places that didn't exist on the public internet. It was as if this person was part of a hidden world that Clint had only scratched the surface of. His research led him to a pattern that confirmed his suspicions. Whoever this was, they were the one calling the shots. But the more Clint dug, the more he realized how little he knew about them. They had built their empire in the shadows for a reason. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, "I've got something. Meet me at the usual place, 30 minutes. It's urgent." Clint's mind raced. He couldn't afford to waste time. If Sarah had something important, he needed to hear it, and fast. He grabbed his coat, locked his apartment, and headed out the door. The street seemed emptier now, as though the city had abandoned him. Clint wasn't sure if it was the growing paranoia or if the real danger was starting to creep closer, but either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just waiting for him to slip up. 30 minutes later, Clint arrived at the alley behind the restaurant. The neon lights of the sign flickered above, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. This was their meeting spot, a safe place, or at least as safe as it could be in a city like this. But tonight, the alley seemed more desolate than usual, its shadows stretching like hands eager to grab hold. Clint stepped into the alley and saw Sarah waiting by the back door, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something more serious. "Clint, we need to talk," Sarah said without preamble, her voice low. Clint nodded, his gut telling him that whatever she had wasn't good. She handed him a manila envelope, the corners of the paper frayed. Clint opened it and pulled out a series of photographs. Each one was more disturbing than the last. They were taken from different angles, but they all depicted the same scene, Clint's office, from a distance. The pictures were recent, taken within the last few days. Someone had been watching him. "This is bad, Clint," Sarah continued, her eyes scanning the street. "They know what we're doing. They're not just watching us, they're waiting for us to make a mistake." Clint stared at the photos, his mind whirling. "How long have they been watching us?" Sarah's voice was filled with a mixture of dread and determination. "Since the moment we started digging into RL Corporation. They've been monitoring every move you've made. Every call, every email, every step. They know you're getting close, Clint. And that means they won't hesitate to take action." Clint's jaw tightened. He had known this was coming, but seeing the photos made it real. This wasn't just about business deals anymore. This was about survival. "We're running out of time," Clint said, looking at Sarah. "We have to move fast. We have to find the people behind this before they find us first." Sarah nodded, the resolve in her eyes mirroring his own. "I'll get the team together. We need to take this fight to them. It's our only shot." Clint didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. "Let's do it." As they walked back into the shadows, Clint knew they had crossed a line. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were fighting for their lives. And the real battle was about to begin. The weight of the photographs that Sarah had handed him hung heavy on Clint's mind. The realization hit him harder than anything else, they were already too close. Whoever was behind RL Corporation was far more dangerous than he had imagined. The people pulling the strings weren't just ruthless, they were meticulous, watching his every move, staying 2 steps ahead. The drive to their safe house wasn't long, but Clint barely registered the journey. His mind raced through scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. He'd taken risks before, even had enemies close to him, but this was different. This time, he wasn't just dealing with one man or a group of criminals looking for profit. He was going up against an organization that played by rules he didn't understand. He glanced at Sarah, sitting beside him, her fingers drumming nervously on her phone. Clint had never seen her this tense before. Normally, she was the calm, collected one, the voice of reason when everything else seemed to be falling apart. But tonight, she was quiet, focused, almost withdrawn. Clint didn't blame her, they both knew the stakes were higher than ever. As they pulled into the garage of the safe house, Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone. The screen lit up with a name he had been hoping not to see, Marco. "Clint, we have a problem," Marco's voice crackled through the line, sounding urgent. "They've got eyes everywhere. I did a little digging for you, but they've already locked down some of their connections. Whoever is pulling the strings is making a move. You're running out of time." Clint's stomach sank. "What kind of move?" Marco's voice lowered. "They're isolating you. Your next move, whatever it is, they already know it. They're tightening the net. If you go public with what you know." Clint didn't let him finish. "I'm not going public. But they won't silence me. Tell me what you've got. What did you find out about RL Corporation?" "I need something concrete, Marco. I need to know who's at the top." Marco was quiet for a moment before answering. "I did find a name, well, part of one. But it's not much. The guy running the whole thing, we've only got a few leads. They've been covering their tracks, Clint. Whoever he is, he's a ghost. But there's one thing I'm sure of, this guy. He's untouchable. You keep pushing, and they'll bury you before you get the chance to finish this. Clint's grip tightened on the wheel. I'm not backing down, Marco. This goes beyond me now. I need to know who they are. Marco sighed. You want to know? You really want to dive deeper? I'll send you what I have, but be careful. People like that don't like to be found. And when they're done with you, Clint, there won't be anything left of you to even bury. Clint clenched his jaw. He had heard enough warnings for a lifetime, but he couldn't stop now. Send me the information. I'll be waiting. With that, he hung up the phone. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, determination, perhaps. But he was more certain than ever that the walls were closing in. The safe house was quiet as Clint paced back and forth in the small, dimly lit room. Sarah was at the table, already on her laptop, trying to track down any leads that could help them in their next move. Her usual energy had been replaced with a palpable sense of urgency. The silence between them was heavy, both of them fully aware of the danger they were in. Clint couldn't help but wonder how long they had before the storm hit. They were being hunted now, not just by Weston but by everyone who stood to lose if the truth came to light. He had no doubt that RL Corporation was already preparing for whatever he would do next. Every step he took, every move he made, was likely being watched by someone who had more power than he could ever imagine. Sarah glanced up at him. You think they're going to make their move tonight? Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the small window, peering out into the night. The streetlights flickered in the distance, and the city's pulse seemed distant, almost like it was no longer part of the world they inhabited. They're already making their move, Clint finally said, his voice low. We've been playing catch-up from the start. But we can't stop now. We're close, Sarah. We have to find out who's behind this. No matter what it takes. She nodded, her expression serious. I'll keep looking. I've got some contacts in high places, people who can help us get the information we need. But Clint. I'm not sure how much more time we have. They're coming for us. Clint's stomach twisted. Then we make our move first. The next few hours felt like they dragged on forever. Clint and Sarah worked through the night, piecing together the fragmented information Marco had sent. They discovered connections between RL Corporation and several high-profile tech companies, financial institutions, and even law enforcement agencies. It was like pulling on a thread that led to a web of corruption, power, and deceit. But despite their best efforts, they still couldn't find the elusive figure at the top of the organization. They were close, but it felt like the closer they got to the truth, the more the walls seemed to close in around them. Every lead they followed seemed to lead to a dead end. As Clint leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an anonymous number. It was brief, but the implications were clear. We know who you are. We know what you've been looking for. Your time is up. Stop before it's too late. Clint stared at the message for a long moment. There was no return number, no identifying information. Just a threat. But it was clear that whoever sent it knew exactly what he was after. They were watching his every move, and they had made their intentions known. He leaned forward, typing out a response, I'm not stopping. I'm coming for you. Before he could hit send, the power in the safe house flickered. The lights blinked, and the hum of the refrigerator stopped. Clint froze. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide. Clint. Before she could finish, the door to the safe house burst open with a loud crash, sending both of them leaping to their feet. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, getting closer. Whoever it was, they were coming for them. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed Sarah's arm. We need to go. Now. The door to the safe house slammed open with a deafening crash, echoing through the dimly lit space. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her behind him. There was no time to think, only to react. Footsteps thundered in the hall outside, growing louder with each passing second. Clint's mind raced. Whoever was coming for them didn't intend to knock politely. The people behind RL Corporation had finally made their move. Clint. Sarah's voice was frantic, her eyes wide with fear. We have to get out of here. He nodded, pulling her toward the back exit. The windows were too risky, they would be exposed. But the back alley would give them a chance, a slim one, to escape. They had planned for moments like this, times when their enemies would make their final move, but the reality was always much more chaotic than they imagined. As Clint and Sarah sprinted toward the rear of the house, the sound of voices filled the hallway. The men outside knew they were inside. They were closing in. The door to the back exit burst open as Clint slammed into it, forcing it to give way. They were in the alley now, the cold air biting at their skin as they scrambled into the shadows. But there was no comfort in the darkness. It only made the threat feel more real. Clint reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, quickly dialing Marco. His fingers shook as he pressed the screen, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The phone rang twice before Marco picked up. Clint, what's going on? Someone's here, Clint growled. We need help. Now. There was a pause on the other end. I'm on it. I've already sent some backup to your location. Stay low and keep moving. You need to buy time. Clint's eyes darted around the alley, his mind working in overdrive. Where's Sarah? I'm right here, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she peeked around the corner. What now? We keep moving, Clint said, his voice low but steady. We have to get to the rendezvous point. Marco's sending backup, but we're on our own for now. They sprinted down the narrow alleyway, every footstep echoing like a warning. Their breath came in ragged gasps, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The alley was a maze of trash cans, graffiti, and old crates, offering little in the way of cover. It felt like every step they took brought them closer to something that could end everything. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared to life behind them. Clint's heart skipped a beat. The men who were after them were in pursuit. They hadn't just been trying to find them, they had been tracking them from the moment they set foot outside the safe house. Keep moving. Clint shouted, pulling Sarah into a narrow passage between two buildings. He could hear the screech of tires as the car sped toward them. The headlights sliced through the darkness like a predator's gaze, searching for its prey. Clint's mind worked frantically. They couldn't outrun the car, not on foot. They needed to find cover, somewhere they could regroup. The city was full of dark corners, but now it seemed like every one of them had eyes watching. Ahead of them, Clint saw an old, rusted fire escape ladder leading to the rooftop of a nearby building. It was risky, climbing up would expose them, but it was their only chance. He didn't hesitate. Up there, he barked at Sarah, pointing toward the ladder. Without waiting for an answer, Clint sprinted toward it, grabbing hold of the ladder and pulling himself up. Sarah was right behind him, but the sound of the car was getting closer, the engine roaring louder as it rounded the corner. They were running out of time. The metal rungs of the ladder felt cold beneath Clint's hands as he climbed faster, pulling Sarah up after him. They reached the rooftop, breathless, just as the car screeched to a halt below them. Clint pulled Sarah to the edge, signaling for her to stay down as he peered over the side. The men who had been chasing them spilled out of the car, weapons drawn. They were fast, too fast. They had anticipated Clint's move, and they were already looking up, scanning the rooftops for any sign of movement. Stay low, Clint whispered, his voice barely audible. The men began to fan out, their movements deliberate. Clint could see their shadows against the flickering streetlights, their forms silhouetted against the night. They were searching for them, methodical, ruthless. For a moment, Clint and Sarah remained still, barely breathing, praying that the men wouldn't notice them. But Clint knew this wouldn't last long. He had to make a move. He had to give them a chance to escape. Then, just as Clint was about to act, his phone buzzed again. It was Marco. "Clint," Marco said urgently. "I've got them. Your backup's on the way, but it's not going to be easy. You need to get out of there, now." Clint's eyes scanned the rooftops, his mind racing. "We're cornered, Marco. They're right below us. We need a plan, or we're done." "Do what you have to do," Marco replied. "Hold your ground if you have to. They can't afford to let you escape. You're the target now, Clint. You need to make it count." Clint's grip tightened around the phone. He wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. He had come too far to let it end like this. "We'll hold them off," Clint said, his voice cold with resolve. "Tell Marco's team to be ready. We'll need them fast." Clint put the phone away, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Sarah. "Get ready." She nodded, her face pale but determined. She had been through enough of this with him to know what came next. Clint pulled a small, compact gun from his waistband, checking it quickly. It was a precaution he had never hoped to use, but tonight was different. The people chasing them wouldn't stop. Not unless he gave them a reason to. As the men below began to move closer to the building's edge, Clint's fingers tightened around the gun. He would give them a reason. "On three," he muttered to Sarah. She gave him a quick nod, her hand sliding to the knife hidden beneath her coat. Together, they were going to make their stand. 3. And then, with a swift motion, Clint sprang into action. Clint's heart raced as he and Sarah took cover behind a concrete barrier on the rooftop. The faint sound of footsteps echoed on the ground below, their pursuers moving methodically, searching for the slightest sign of movement. Clint's grip tightened around the gun, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. "Stay quiet," Clint whispered, his breath shallow. "We need to make them think we've left the building." Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. She held a small knife in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, but there was fire in her eyes. She was ready to fight, and Clint knew she wouldn't hesitate when the time came. The minutes felt like hours as they lay low, listening intently. The men below seemed to be getting closer, but Clint knew they couldn't stay in hiding for long. The backup Marco had promised was still on its way, but Clint wasn't sure how long they had. Clint's mind raced. They needed to make a move. If they didn't, they'd be sitting ducks on this rooftop. They had to get to the edge, make a jump to the next building, and disappear into the labyrinth of alleyways. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one they had. Just as Clint was about to signal to Sarah to move, a loud crash rang out from the alleyway below. Someone had found the door to the rooftop. Clint's instincts kicked in. The men were close, too close. He could hear their muffled voices and the sound of boots scraping against the ground. They were making their way up, and they were well armed. Clint's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah's wrist. He pulled her closer to him. "On my signal, we move. No hesitation." She met his gaze, her jaw set. "Ready when you are." Clint watched as the figures of two men appeared on the edge of the rooftop, their shadows stark against the streetlights. They were wearing black tactical gear, faces obscured by masks. They were trained professionals. They knew what they were doing. Clint didn't have much of a chance against them in a direct fight, but he was betting on their arrogance. They wouldn't expect him to fight back. They'd be too sure that he was trapped. Without waiting any longer, Clint shot to his feet, his gun raised in one smooth motion. He aimed at the closer of the two men, who had just stepped fully onto the roof. The man's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. Clint squeezed the trigger, sending a precise shot into the man's shoulder. He staggered back, cursing under his breath, but Clint had already moved. He darted behind a stack of metal crates, motioning for Sarah to follow. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night as the second man scrambled for cover. "Go!" Clint hissed, his voice tight with urgency. Sarah was already on her feet, sprinting for the corner of the building, her knife drawn. Clint's eyes darted around, searching for their next move. The street below was still empty, the darkness hiding their escape route. But the backup hadn't arrived yet. Time was running out. "Clint!" Sarah shouted from the corner of the rooftop. "This way!" Clint's heart skipped a beat. Sarah had found an old fire escape ladder leading down to the alley. It wasn't a perfect escape, but it would buy them a few precious seconds. Clint didn't wait for her to say another word. He bolted for the ladder, climbing down quickly. He heard the footsteps of the remaining man pounding after them, but Clint didn't dare look back. They reached the alleyway, breathless and disoriented, but they weren't safe yet. The faint sound of a car engine revving in the distance made Clint's blood run cold. They had company. The pursuers were closing in, and Clint knew they couldn't afford to be caught out in the open. "Move, move!" Clint barked at Sarah as they darted into another alley. The sound of the car grew louder, the engine roaring with intent. Sarah grabbed his hand. "We have to get to the rendezvous point, now." Clint nodded, his mind racing. They had no choice. They had to reach Marco's team before it was too late. But as they rounded the corner of the alley, they skidded to a halt. The car they had heard earlier was parked at the end of the narrow passage, its headlights shining brightly, blocking their exit. Clint swore under his breath, and Sarah tensed, her hand reaching for the knife again. They were trapped. The door of the car opened, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted by the harsh glow of the headlights. Clint's breath caught in his throat. The man walking toward them was tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of danger that was palpable. But it was his face that made Clint freeze. It was Weston. "Clint," Weston said, his voice calm and calculating, "you've been a thorn in my side for far too long. You should have known better than to dig into RL Corporation. But now, you've crossed the line." Clint's blood boiled. The last thing he had expected was to find Weston here, in the middle of the chaos. But the truth was undeniable. Weston had been behind it all. "You're not going to get away with this, Weston," Clint said, his voice low, tinged with anger. "You're not going to bury the truth." Weston smiled, his eyes cold. "The truth? There's no truth here, Clint. There's only power. And power always wins." Clint's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, but before he could make his move, Weston raised a hand, signaling for the men behind him to stay back. "You're done. We'll make sure your little crusade ends here, tonight. No one will ever know about RL Corporation or what you've uncovered. No one will believe you." Clint's jaw clenched. He had no intention of going down without a fight, but Weston wasn't wrong. If Clint didn't act now, everything he had worked for, the truth, his fight, would be erased in the blink of an eye. "You really think you can control everything?" Clint sneered. "You can't stop the truth from coming out, Weston." "Watch me," Weston said, his tone final. Just as he took a step forward, there was a loud screeching sound in the distance. The sound of another car speeding toward them. Clint didn't waste another second. He shoved Sarah behind him, raising his gun once more. It was now or never. The screeching of tires in the distance pierced through the tension in the alley. Clint's pulse quickened as he heard the rumble of another car coming closer. His hand instinctively tightened around the gun's grip. This wasn't just a standoff anymore. It was a race against time. Weston's smug expression remained unchanged as he took another step forward. You can't escape this, Clint, Weston said, his voice a low, almost bored drawl. You've been a thorn in my side for far too long. I think it's time to put an end to this charade. Clint's eyes flicked over his shoulder. The backup Marco had promised should be arriving any second now, but in that moment, it felt like time itself had slowed to a crawl. Sarah was pressed tightly against the brick wall, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear but steely with determination. She knew what was at stake, what they were up against. Clint shot a quick look at Weston's men. They were spread out behind him, their eyes trained on Clint, waiting for any sign of weakness. These men weren't just hired thugs, they were professionals. They were ruthless. And right now, they had Clint and Sarah cornered. You'll never get away with this, Clint muttered through clenched teeth, taking a step forward. His gun was still raised, but his mind was already racing. He had to make a decision, fight or run. He couldn't outrun these men. There was no way to escape the grip of RL Corporation. It was now or never. A sudden crash broke Clint's thoughts, something heavy slammed into the alley just beyond their position. Without hesitation, Clint spun around, instinctively stepping between Sarah and the noise. His mind quickly processed the sound. There were more footsteps now, quick, urgent. Then, through the smoke of adrenaline, he heard it clearly, the distinct hum of engines pulling up, the unmistakable sound of Marco's backup arriving. Clint's heart skipped a beat. They weren't too late. Weston's eyes flicked to the incoming vehicles, his face tightening with anger. He wasn't used to being caught off guard. But Clint wasn't about to let him have the satisfaction of believing he had the upper hand. Get down! Clint shouted, yanking Sarah into a crouch just as the headlights of the incoming cars illuminated the alley. The blinding light bounced off the walls, casting elongated shadows that danced like ghosts. Weston hissed, his face contorting with fury. You think these people will save you? He raised a hand to signal his men, but before he could give the order, Clint moved. Without missing a beat, Clint darted into the shadows, moving fast, the gun still clutched tightly in his hand. The men nearest to him spun, trying to get a shot off, but Clint was already in motion. He sprinted towards the incoming cars, not bothering to glance back. Clint! Sarah's voice called out, but Clint knew he couldn't afford to wait. The backup had arrived. Marco's men, an elite team of operatives who had been tracking RL Corporation for months, were here. The first of Marco's men, a large figure with a broad build, stepped out of the car, immediately opening fire on Weston's team. The sound of gunshots rang out like a violent symphony, the air thick with tension. Marco's backup was taking charge, clearing the alley with surgical precision, and Clint moved through the chaos like a shadow, dodging and weaving, until he was right at the heart of it. He saw Marco, his trusted ally, standing beside one of the vehicles, his face grim and determined. Marco's eyes locked with Clint's, and without a word, they both knew what had to be done. You're not going to get away with this, Clint growled at Weston, his voice low and filled with venom. His eyes burned with fury, this fight was far from over. Weston, realizing the tide was turning, tried to bark orders, but his men were already on the defensive, retreating under the fire from Marco's team. Panic flickered across Weston's face as he tried to make his escape, but Clint wasn't about to let him slip away again. Clint broke from the cover of the vehicles, sprinting towards Weston, his gun raised and ready. But just as Clint was about to close the distance, something unexpected happened. A sharp, metallic sound cut through the air, followed by a sudden explosion that sent Clint sprawling to the ground. He had no time to react, only to shield himself as the blast rocked the alley, debris flying everywhere. The world spun around him as he struggled to get his bearings. His ears rang, and for a moment, he couldn't see through the dust cloud that had enveloped the alley. He could hear voices shouting, the harsh crack of gunfire still ringing in the distance. Clint! Sarah's voice reached him through the haze, weak but urgent. Clint forced himself to his knees, shaking off the disorientation. Blood pounded in his ears as he pushed through the confusion. The explosion had thrown him off course, but it hadn't taken him down. He could still fight. He had to fight. "Sarah," he called out, his voice hoarse. He spotted her in the distance, crouched behind one of the cars, her face filled with concern. But she was still alive. Weston's men were regrouping, but they were disorganized, rattled. Marco's team was pushing forward, securing the area. The moment Clint had been waiting for was here. He could finish this. Clint staggered to his feet, his head spinning, but his resolve was unwavering. He turned to Marco, who was already scanning the area with steely eyes. "It's now or never," Marco said, his voice firm. He had been a trusted ally in this fight, and now they had Weston cornered. There was no room for mercy. Clint nodded, determination settling over him like a shield. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He wasn't even fighting for Sarah. He was fighting for everyone Weston had hurt, for everyone who had fallen victim to RL Corporation. Clint's eyes locked with Weston, who was now backed into a corner. There was nowhere left for him to run. "Clint, you don't know what you're getting into," Weston said, his voice laced with desperation. He was trying to reason with him, but Clint knew better. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Clint replied coldly, raising his gun. And then, with a flash of movement, Clint pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the alley, louder than any sound Clint had heard in his life. The world seemed to stop for a moment, frozen in time as the reality of what had just happened hit like a ton of bricks. Clint's hand shook as the echo of the shot reverberated in his ears, but his eyes were fixed on Weston's motionless body, crumpled at the foot of the wall. Blood pooled around him, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the concrete. For a split second, Clint couldn't breathe. The man who had been the puppet master behind so much pain, deceit, and destruction, was gone. But even in the midst of his victory, Clint felt no joy, no sense of triumph. Just a profound sense of emptiness. Marco stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the area. "It's over," he said, his voice low, filled with a mixture of finality and relief. The backup team was securing the perimeter, making sure no other enemies were lurking, but the fight was essentially over. Weston was dead. Clint didn't respond right away. His mind was still reeling. He had spent so long chasing the truth, bringing down a corrupt empire, only to finally see it crumble before him. Yet, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that had taken too long to finish, a battle that had cost too much. "Clint," Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with concern. She had approached him, standing just a few feet away now. Her eyes searched his face for any hint of relief or satisfaction, but all she saw was the same haunted expression that had been there for the past few months. "You did it. It's over." Clint looked at her, his chest tightening. "Is it?" His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the exhaustion that weighed down on him. "Is it really over? We've taken down Weston, but what happens now? What happens to all the lives he ruined, the families torn apart?" Sarah took a step closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You've done what no one else could. You've exposed the truth. The world will know what RL Corporation did. The world will know what Weston was behind. That's more than most people ever get. You've made sure that his reign ends here." Clint nodded slowly, but the nagging feeling of something unresolved gnawed at him. It was like he had lost so much in this fight that even the thought of a future felt distant, unreachable. Was it really possible to move on from something like this? Would life ever feel normal again? The sound of footsteps approaching broke Clint from his thoughts. Marco, still the ever-watchful leader, stood nearby. He gave Clint a long, silent look, his eyes saying more than words could. There was a respect between them now, forged through the trials of battle and trust that had been built on the foundation of shared purpose. "Clint," Marco said, breaking the silence. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Weston wasn't the only one pulling the strings. There's still the matter of RL Corporation itself, the people he was working with. We can't let them slip away, too." Clint nodded, his mind shifting back into action mode. He knew Marco was right. Even with Weston gone, the organization still existed, and the people behind it would need to be dealt with. They had been part of a vast network of corruption that stretched far beyond just one man. "I know," Clint said, his voice steadying. "I won't stop until every last one of them is exposed." Sarah stepped up beside him. "And I'll be there to help. You're not alone in this." Clint gave her a grateful look, his heart warming at her unwavering support. Sarah had been by his side through the worst of it, through the long nights, the betrayals, and the fear. She had become more than an ally, she was a partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had taken on the world's darkest corners. Together, they would see this through to the end. "We'll get them all," Clint said, more resolute than ever. Days passed since the fall of Weston, and the city began to breathe again. The weight of the secrets that had burdened the streets for so long was starting to lift, but the scars left behind would never fully fade. Clint had seen too much, lost too much to ever pretend things could go back to the way they once were. But there was a new sense of purpose in his step now. The mission was clear. The battle wasn't over, but it was different. Weston's death had been a significant blow to RL Corporation, but the organization still existed. And Clint wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. Marco's team had already begun taking down the remaining leaders, working in the shadows to pull apart the rest of the organization. Their connections ran deep, and while they were taking steps to dismantle the empire, Clint knew they needed more than just force. They needed the truth, the full story that could be used to bring the whole thing crashing down. Clint and Sarah sat in their small office, the dim lights overhead casting long shadows across their faces. The room was quiet except for the soft clicking of keys on a laptop as Sarah scrolled through files and documents. She had been working non-stop to gather intel, tracking down leads, and uncovering the hidden connections that RL Corporation had cultivated over the years. Clint leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall, his mind running through the next steps. He had come a long way, but it felt like the road ahead was still a long one. It wasn't just about putting a stop to Weston and his people anymore. It was about finding a way to rebuild, finding a way to heal the wounds left by their actions. "I'm not sure how to fix all this," Clint said softly, his eyes distant. "There's so much damage, so much pain. I don't know if we can ever undo what they did." Sarah stopped typing, her gaze lifting to meet his. There was understanding in her eyes, but also something else, something Clint couldn't quite place. "We don't have to fix it all," she said quietly. "We just have to make sure it never happens again." Clint looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was right. The road ahead wasn't about undoing the past. It was about preventing the future from being haunted by the same mistakes. They couldn't change what had already happened, but they could control what came next. The sound of a knock at the door broke their quiet conversation. Marco stepped in, his expression still serious, but there was something lighter about him now. "We've got work to do, Clint." Clint stood up, meeting Marco's gaze. It wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of something new. A new fight, a new cause, a new chance to make a real difference. Clint nodded, a small but resolute smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Let's get to work." As the story closes, Clint reflects on the challenges that lie ahead. With Weston dead, the organization's future uncertain, and the road to justice still winding, Clint finds a sense of peace in knowing that he has done all he can to start changing the world. Together with Sarah, Marco, and the team, Clint moves forward, ready to continue the fight for truth, justice, and the hope that tomorrow can be better than today. The story may have ended, but the journey had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?